Belle Starr has come down through time as one of the great anti-heroines of the Old West. She is the Bandit Queen, the female Robin Hood who was quick with her fists and even quicker with a Colt 45. The reality, though, was quite different. The Belle of history was a battler who made some bad choices in men, ended up twice widowed with 2 children, and made the most of the cards she was dealt, only to meet the most violent of ends. In today's Biographics, we go beyond the legends to reveal the real Belle Starr. Myra Maybelle Shirley, the future Belle Starr, was born on February 5, 1848 in Jasper County, southwest Missouri. With that fact established, drilling down on the rest of her life becomes far less certain. Much of what is accepted is the stuff of dime novel fiction. Sorting out the fact from the fiction here, it's been a bit of a major challenge. Now, we do know that her father, John Shirley, was onto his 3rd wife when Myra came along. That 3rd wife was named Eliza Pennington Hatfield, and she was a member of the Hatfield family who famously feuded with the McCoys. The couple had 3 other children, all of them boys, with Myra being the 2nd oldest. John Shirley, he was a wheat, corn, and hog farmer. When Myra was 6 years of age, he sold the farm for a tidy profit and relocated the family to Carthage, Missouri. He invested in real estate, managing to take possession of an entire city block that housed a livery stable, blacksmith shop, a tavern, and a hotel. John Shirley, he was a slave owner who was ardently pro-slavery. In the explosive years before the Civil War, tensions they were high between pro- and anti-slavery forces in Missouri. When his oldest son, Bud, joined an infamous gang of Confederate sympathizers known as Quantrill's Raiders, John, he was extremely proud. Meanwhile, Myra, who insisted that she be called Belle, was growing into a fine young lady. Her parents were among the most prominent in Carthage, and she was able to enjoy a life of semi-privilege. She attended the Carthage Female Academy, doing well in her studies, where she studied languages, mathematics, and grammar. She was also a talented piano player who would entertain guests in the lobby of the family-owned hotel. When he was home from his raiding expeditions, Belle's older brother Bud taught her how to shoot. She became an excellent shot, developing a reputation as a markswoman that would later fuel her reputation as the Bandit Queen. So, Belle was 13 when the Civil War erupted. Carthage found itself as a central point of hostilities, with no fewer than 13 battles being waged in the surrounding area during the 4 years of the conflict. With the war right on their doorstep, every person in Carthage was forced to choose sides. Pro- and anti-Confederacy factions developed, with tensions escalating every single day. It has been reported that a teenage Belle acted as a spy for the Confederacy, and even that she joined Quantrill's Raiders. Both suggestions are unlikely. However, any news that she may have gotten about Union troop movements she would no doubt have passed on to Bud. In June 1864, Bud was shot and killed by Union soldiers in Sarcoxie, Missouri, when they surrounded a house that he was in. Desperate to prevent any further tragedy, the family packed up and they moved to Texas. It turns out they got out of Carthage at just the right time. 3 months later, it was burned to the ground by Confederate rebels determined to drive Union soldiers out of the town. Belle drove one of the family's wagons as they wound their way down from Missouri to a small town 10 miles southeast of Dallas called Syene. Things didn't go nearly as well for the Shirleys in Texas as they had gone in Missouri. John had hoped to reinvest in a hotel, but those plans didn't work out and he was forced to return to farming. Conflict arose with the locals who accused John of taking more than his share of water from the communal well. Belle was enrolled at the local one-room schoolhouse. Her attendance, however, it was pretty erratic. This was probably just because she was bored of the material, having already covered it when she was in Carthage. While back in Carthage, Belle had come across a boy by the name of John Reed. Reed, who was 2 years older than Belle, joined Quantrill's Raiders when he was 17. He was tall and stocky, and his ability with his fists and a gun had earned him the respect of the other members of the gang. Belle admired him from afar, but her family moved away before a relationship could develop. Belle was ecstatic to learn that sometime around 1865, the Reeds had also relocated to Texas. They quickly became a couple, and on the 1st of November 1866, they were married. Belle was 18 at the time. Jim and Belle, they moved in with the Shirley family, where Jim helped out on the family farm. Jim didn't take to farm work and he tried his hand as a salesman. He worked for a saddle maker in Dallas, selling saddles and bridles for a time. By the end of 1867, however, Jim's family had moved back to Missouri. He and Belle decided to join them. The Reeds set themselves up on a farm in Bates County. Jim worked the lands with his brothers. Then, in September of 1868, Belle gave birth to a daughter, Rosie Lee. From the start, Belle took to calling the baby her little Pearl. Soon after this, everyone was calling the baby Pearl. The first opportunity that John and Eliza Shirley had to see their granddaughter was when Belle returned to Texas to attend the funeral of her younger brother, Ed. The events surrounding the murder are cloudy, but it appears that he was involved in horse theft. Following the funeral and reunion with her parents, Belle returned to the Reed farm in Missouri. Her relationship with Jim, it was strained as he spent less and less time on the farm and more time at the horse racing track. It was while at the races that Jim ran into a man named Tom Starr. Starr was a half-Cherokee outlaw who made a living by selling whiskey in Indian Territory, a practice which happened to be a federal crime. Starr ran the enterprise with his sons, and they were soon joined by Jim Reed. Jim's foray into the outlaw world, it escalated dramatically when his brother Scott was murdered. Jim vowed revenge and hunted down the killer, dispatching both him and his brother. Belle now found herself with a husband who was being hunted by not just the law, but also the friends of the man who had killed. We don't know what he did there to support the family, but suspicions are strong that it was through such nefarious means as stagecoach robbery and gambling. On February the 22nd, 1871, Belle gave birth to a second child, a boy who they named James Edwin, nicknamed Eddie. Only a month later, Jim was accused of a counterfeit money scam and was forced again to relocate his family. When the LA authorities began looking into his case, they discovered that he was also wanted for murder. Jim skipped town and made his way on horseback to Texas. Belle and the two children, they followed him by stagecoach. In March 1871, Belle turned up at the family farm in Texas with 2 kids and a wanted husband. Belle's father helped them set up on a small farm near Coon Creek in Boss County, but Jim Reed had already proven that he was no farmer. Soon, the farm was attracting a regular assortment of vagabonds who would sit around with Jim and plan out their various crimes. Jim became involved in livestock rustling when he learned that a local man by the name of Dick Cravey had $4,000 in cash stashed at his home. Jim and his brother Sol couldn't resist the temptation. However, the robbery was botched and they ended up murdering Cravey. A few months later, the brothers were accused of murdering another man. This man, whose last name was Wheeler, had apparently reported to the authorities what he knew about the Reed mob's illegal activities. He was found with his tongue cut out. This latest outrage resulted in both Jim and Sol having a $500 reward placed on their capture, dead or alive. And of course, it was time to move once again. Leaving the children with Belle's parents, the couple headed into Choctaw Indian Territory, where the authorities would be unable to follow them. Jim was unable to stay out of trouble, though. On November 19, 1873, along with 2 accomplices, he rode to the farm of a wealthy retired judge who lived near the South Canadian River. The judge and his wife, they were hung from a tree and forced to divulge the location of the cash in the house. The bandits, they got away with a huge sum of $30,000. By now, the strain on the marriage, it was simply too much. Belle was fed up with the life of crime that her husband had forced her into. She packed up and she took the children back to the family farm in Syene. Reed headed for San Antonio, where he took up with a woman named Rosa McComas. He continued his outlaw ways, but fate caught up with him when a former associate shot him in the back on August 6, 1874. Belle was now a widow and she had 2 young children to take care of. She stayed on the family farm with her parents. In 1876, John Shirley died. This forced Eliza to sell the farm and relocate to Dallas. Belle and the children, they went with her. Allegedly, Belle was briefly married for 3 weeks to Charles Younger, uncle of Cole Younger, in 1878, but this is not substantiated by any evidence, it's just a rumor. On June 5, 1880, Belle married Sam Starr, the son of her husband's former associate Tom Starr, and they settled in the Indian Territory. There, she learned ways of organizing, planning, and fencing for the rustlers, horse thieves, and bootleggers, as well as harboring them from the law. At 23, the half-Cherokee Sam was 9 years younger than his new bride. They moved into Cherokee Nation territory and settled into a homestead some 760 miles southwest of Fort Smith. They cleared 3 acres of land and planted corn. There were plenty of fish in the nearby river, and game was also plentiful. It seemed like the ideal existence, and it could have been if Belle's past hadn't gotten in the way. Former associates of Jim Reed, they began to learn that Belle had a hideout in Indian Territory which was safe from the reach of the law. So many of these outlaws started showing up that Belle was forced to convert a nearby cave into a sort of robber's roost with 3 log cabins being erected. Up until now, Belle had managed to keep herself from any actual involvement in illegal activity. This changed in 1882 when she and Sam asked a neighbor if they could put some horses in his pen prior to selling them. The neighbor agreed, but on inspection pointed out that at least 2 of the horses belonged to other local farmers. Sam and Belle ignored the claims and went ahead and sold the horses. When the original owners of the stolen horses found out, they pressed charges. Sam and Belle, they were handed an indictment to appear before the court on the charge of larceny. Sam's father, Tom, he put up bail for the couple. Both Belle and Sam, they were found guilty. Sam was given a year's prison time in Detroit, Michigan, while Belle was sentenced to 2 concurrent 6-month spells at the same facility. With their mother and stepfather in jail, the children were farmed out to family and friends. Sam and Belle, they were model prisoners, earning themselves an early release after 9 months. They settled back into life on the farm, and things, they were pretty quiet for a few months. Then, in December of 1884, a former associate of Jim Reed by the name of Jim Middleton turned up, looking for a place of refuge from the law. Middleton was wanted for murder, and the law, they were pretty hot on his trail. Middleton hung around the area for several months. Then, one day, Belle and Sam's ranch was raided by law enforcement officers from Lamar County. The officers had received permission from the Cherokee Nation leaders to conduct the raid. Middleton was not at the residence at the time, but the raid scared him enough to make him want to make a run for it. But with the law so close on his trail, he couldn't figure out a way to get out of the area without being detected. Belle came to his rescue, though, suggesting that she drive a wagon with the children in tow to visit relatives in Arkansas. Middleton would hide in the wagon covers and make his getaway when they were clear of prying eyes. The plan, it was working well, and after some time, Middleton was ready to light out on his own. However, 17-year-old Pearl refused to let him take a horse. This led to 14-year-old Eddie heading off to the nearest farm in an attempt to buy a horse. He came back with a broken-down, half-blind mare. It was hardly the ideal getaway transport, but it was all that Middleton had, and he sat out on his own with Belle's Colt 45 as his only protection. 5 days later, the horse was found in some scrub on a riverbank not far from Fort Smith. Then, on May the 11th, 1885, Middleton's body was found a couple of hundred yards downstream. The authorities soon traced the gun that was in his holster back to Belle. They also discovered that the horse, though legitimately purchased by Eddie, had previously been stolen. The end result was that Belle was once again up on charges of larceny. This time around, Belle was found not guilty. However, she returned home only to discover that her husband Sam had been wounded in a shootout with the Indian police. Sam had now become ensconced in his own life of crime. Fearful of the rough justice that Indian police were likely to dish out, Belle convinced him to hand himself in to the federal authorities. Sam was indicted for trial in February of 1887 and then released on bail. On December the 17th, Sam, Belle, and the children attended a party at a neighbor's house. Everything, it was laughter and merriment until Frank West, the local law officer, turned up. He and Sam got into an argument that soon devolved into a gun battle. Within minutes, both of the men were dead. Belle Starr was now widowed for the second time. Sam's death made possession of the ranch on Cherokee land a bit of a problem. They had not bought the land, it was in their possession because of Sam's Indian blood. Now that he was dead, however, Belle's right of possession was disputed. With pressure mounting on her to get out of Cherokee territory, she decided there was another solution. She married Sam's brother, Bill July, alias Jim Starr. And with that, she was once again married to a Cherokee, and so she had possession rights to the land. Now 39, Belle was 15 years older than her third husband. The marriage of convenience, it was not pleasing to Pearl, aged 19, or Eddie, aged 17. Both of them constantly argued with Jim, which was a source of ongoing frustration for Belle. Around this time, Pearl fell in love with a young man who, in the course of time, approached Belle to ask her consent to marry her daughter. Belle flatly refused, giving the reason that she had long told Pearl that she could only marry a man who had at least $25,000 worth of property. She later tried to trick the young man by sending him a letter with Pearl's forged signature on it, stating that she had married someone else. The young couple, though, they soon figured out the ruse and continued to see each other behind Belle's back. Before long, Pearl became pregnant. Belle, she was not happy, giving her daughter 2 options: have an abortion or never bring the child into her presence. Pearl chose the latter option, giving birth to a girl called Flossie on April the 22nd, 1887. She took the baby to live with her paternal grandparents. In 1887, Jim was arrested for horse theft. By this time, however, Belle was making an effort to go straight. She had stopped allowing fugitives to use her place as a hideout. When it came time for Jim's trial, she refused to assist in his defense. Meanwhile, young Eddie Starr was having his own problems. He was shot while trying to steal a horse. Belle feared that he would die. She sent a message to Pearl telling her that she had better come back to see her brother for the last time. She added, however, that she was not to bring the baby. Pearl returned to see Eddie, who recovered from his injury. Belle put pressure on her daughter to give up Flossie for a adoption during the visit. Pearl outrightly refused, but Belle was a stubborn woman. She maneuvered things behind the scenes, and Flossie was taken from Pearl and placed into an orphanage in November of 1888. Eddie was now up on horse theft charges of his own. Again, Belle refused to participate in the defense. Eddie's trial was scheduled for March of 1889. He returned to the family homestead and reportedly threatened to kill his mother. He then took off, never to see Belle again. Belle's problems escalated when a couple, the Watsons, turned up at the farm looking for sharecropping work. Belle decided to take them up on their offer, keen to earn some extra money. Belle became quite friendly with Mrs. Watson. On one occasion, the woman revealed that her husband was actually wanted for murder. This caused warning bells in Belle's mind. If the Cherokee Tribal Council found out that she was again harboring fugitives, they would surely kick her off the land. Belle offered to give the Watsons their sharecropping fee back in order to get them to leave, but Edgar Watson, he refused. It was only when Belle revealed that she knew that Watson was a wanted man that he left, taking up with his wife in a nearby tenant cabin. On July 2, 1889, Belle and her young husband Jim, they left on horseback to meet Jim's trial appointment at Fort Smith. Belle's intention was to accompany him halfway, pay a debt at a store on Kings Creek, and then return home. They stayed the night with friends some 20 miles from Fort Smith. The next morning, Belle turned for home while Jim carried on to the fort. Belle stopped off at Kings Creek, where she had lunch at the local store. Further along the trail, she stopped at the home of a man named Jackson Rowe. This was a popular meeting place for locals. She hoped to see her son Eddie, who had been staying there, but he left before she arrived. Present, though, was Edgar Watson, the sharecropper who Belle had forced off her land. As he saw Belle arrive, he promptly left. After a short time eating and conversing with friends, Belle got back on her horse and continued towards home. However, she never made it. She was blasted from her horse by a shotgun blast. The killer then approached the dying figure on the ground and blasted again. Belle's panicked horse, it galloped for home. The concerned Pearl set out to find her mother. By the time she got to the murder site, a young boy had already found the body. Belle was taken to a farmhouse, barely alive. Pearl was just in time to be alongside her at the moment that her mother took her last breath. The question of who killed Belle Starr has intrigued historians for well over a century. Both of her children have been suspects. Eddie had threatened his mother at least once after she had disciplined him with a bullwhip, but the most likely candidate is Edgar Watson. Watson was actually put on trial for the murder, however the evidence was deemed as circumstantial and he was acquitted. He eventually returned to Florida, where he was killed in a shootout with a posse. No other efforts were ever made to track down the killer of Belle Starr. There were several other potential suspects besides Watson, including July himself. Apparently, July had been caught with a young Cherokee girl, and Belle had been making his life hell. Just a few weeks after Belle's death, July was mortally wounded by a deputy who was on his trail. So the facts of Belle Starr's life are not exactly as exciting or as outlandish as the fictionalized version that began with the dime novel Belle Starr the Bandit Queen or The Female Jesse James in 1889. In summarizing her life for a Fort Smith elevator reporter about a year before her death, Belle said, "I regard myself as a woman who has seen much of life." The reality was that she was not the female Jesse James. She wasn't even a bandit queen. What she was a twice-widowed woman with 2 children who did what she could to survive, only to later be shot down in cold blood. Hers is a story of hardship and tragedy in the real Old West. Her gravesite is near Ufair Lake, Oklahoma. A horse was engraved on her tombstone, along with these words: "Shed not for her the bitter tear, nor give the heart to vain regret. 'Tis but the casket that lies here, the gem that filled it sparkles yet." So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, give us a thumbs up below and don't forget to subscribe. If you're looking for something else to watch right now, though, check out a video from the archives linked to on the screen. Or if you're looking for something completely different to watch, why not check out another channel I do called Top 10s? Find a link to that below. And as always, thank you for watching.